Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to day 2 of Cycle 15. I am very happy to have with us today an old friend and a passionate defender of liberty, Bumper Hornberger, also known as Jacob Hornberger of the Future of Freedom Foundation. Take it away, Bumper.
Oh, it's great to be here with you for this program, and thank you for inviting me to share ideas on liberty with people, from what I understand, come from all over the world. And I'm here to talk to you about freedom and free markets. Now, I think the best place to start in a subject like this is with the American Declaration of Independence, which enunciates principles that apply not just to Americans, but to apply to people all over the world. The most dramatic part of that declaration is the part that says about man's rights. It says that all men, all people, have been endowed with certain fundamental rights, God-given rights, rights that pre-exist government, rights that don't come from government. And these rights include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now again, these rights adhere to all people everywhere. The reason that is so dramatic and so revolutionary is that obviously that's not the mindset of government officials throughout history. Government officials have always taken the position that they provide privileges to people, but privileges can be regulated and controlled, while rights that pre-exist government are immune from government control and regulation. Now, interestingly enough, in that very same year that the Declaration was written by Thomas Jefferson, a man from Scotland, a Scottish philosopher named Adam Smith, published one of the most revolutionary and remarkable books in history. It was called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. And what Smith posited in The Wealth of Nations was the notion that when government doesn't interfere with economic activity through regulation, through control, that people's standard of living will rise. Now, he was writing in a period of time called mercantilism, in which life was very, very short. It wasn't a prosperous period. People were suffering from privation, famine, starvation, and in fact had been for centuries. And that was the reason why government had been, during that period of time, regulating people's economic activities, managing the economy. For example, you had anti-speculation laws in the Middle Ages that punished people that were buying low and selling high because that took advantage of the poor people. There were laws against middlemen that ensured that the poor people would pay the lowest possible price. You know, price controls and minimum wage laws and things like this. Well, along comes Smith in this dramatic revolutionary treatise and says, you know, if government isn't doing these things, the standard of living of the poor and everyone in society will start to rise, and rise dramatically. And so here we have the seeds for this principle of free enterprise. And what is meant by that term, free enterprise, is enterprise that is free of government control and regulation. It doesn't mean less government control and regulation. It means the absence of government control and regulation. So when we combine Thomas Jefferson's enunciation of fundamental rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness with Smith's economic principles of free enterprise, we come up with a very, very interesting, dramatic, revolutionary concept. And that concept is the concept of economic liberty. Because when we talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we still have to define what these terms mean. You know, what does it mean to be free? Some people might say, well, look, freedom involves the right to worship God in your own way, or not to worship God if you choose not to. That this should be this is an inherent right of individuals to make this choice on their own. It should not be mandated by the government. It should not be prohibited by the government. In fact, government plays no role in this at all. And we see this principle of liberty enunciated, for example, in the First Amendment to the Constitution, which is addressed to Congress, but really addresses the entire federal government, where our American ancestors said, we are prohibiting the federal government from regulating religion. I mean, that was really the principle here. Why? Well, because religious decisions are an inherent right of people. It's part of liberty, and they exist independent of government. They pre-exist the government. So government doesn't have the legitimate authority to regulate churches or decide how much ministers are going to be paid or what's going to happen with the donations that are coming into the church. In other words, that's what we mean by a separation of church and state. Now, if a criminal offense is committed by a priest or a minister or whoever, he's subject to the laws of the state in that jurisdiction. But notice that you don't have government regulators coming into the churches and monitoring their activities and making sure that their masses or their church proceedings are at a certain time. There is this separation there. We understand that as part of the aspects of religious liberty. Well, the same principle applies to economic liberty, certain fundamental rights that exist independent of the government. For example, when we talk about the right to life, we're talking about the right to sustain one's life. And how does one do that? Well, ordinarily, especially in a very impoverished society, he does it through labor. He goes to work. He sustains his life by, let's say, planting some crops on his own property, living off those, or more commonly, he goes to work for somebody, and then with the money that he receives in that job, he goes out and buys the food that someone else has produced, or he opens up a business in which he hires people or works on his own. But it's all part of this right to sustain one's life through labor. Now, there's also the concept of just engaging in economic transactions and trade with others. So you have the concept, first of all, that you have a right to sustain your life through labor by engaging in occupations and professions without government interference or control. But then you have the consumer on the other side who makes the decisions as to whether you stay in business or not. Because while you're free to offer your labor services or your goods that you're putting into the marketplace, no one's forced to accept them, because that's part of liberty too, that people have the choice that if you hold yourself out as a lawyer or a shoe shine person, somebody can come along and say, well, I don't really like the job you do in this occupation, and I'm not going to hire you. So you have to go out and get another job if you're going to survive. And in this process, you enter into exchanges with other people. Labor exchanges, where you get paid money in return for your time and services that you provide the company, or you provide goods that you exchange with others. Let's say you go out and produce a bunch of beets, and you take those beets to market and you exchange them for apples or for gold coins, and you use those gold coins to purchase something else. But in this process of exchange with other people, notice something important here, that everybody's standard of living is being raised in the process of just the exchange. Now, how do we know that? Well, because in every exchange, what the person's giving up, he values less than what he's getting. Otherwise, he wouldn't be entering into the exchange. So you have this phenomenon then where people are engaging in economic enterprise without any kind of interference. They're providing goods and services that they're offering to others, and everybody else is doing the same thing. And then people are entering into exchanges in which the standard of living is rising because people are giving up things they value less and getting things they value more. Now, in this process, you have the concept of the fruits of a person's earnings. That as you exchange with others, you start accumulating wealth. Starts out with just a little bit, but people save a little bit, they put it away, and over time that saving starts getting larger and larger, and that's where Adam Smith was alluding to when he talked about the capital in society, that those savings go into banks, businessmen, the employers, go into the banks and say, well, we'd like to borrow the money that you have available here, and they make a deal with the bank to borrow the money, pay an interest rate to the bank, and they use that money to go out and buy, let's say, tractors or computers that make the workers who have put their savings in the banks more productive. And in that additional productivity is then the key to rising standards of living, because let's say a farm is producing 1,000 bushels of wheat a month, but then all of a sudden, because of equipment, technology, it's now producing 10,000 bushels of wheat a month. Well, clearly now there's more to be paid to the workers. The standard of living of the employer has risen, but also the standard of living of the employees. And as Smith pointed out, is that you don't really need to wait for the benevolence of the employer or depend on his benevolence to pay the higher wages. That's where the competitive process comes in. That as other firms are doing the same thing and they're accumulating wealth, they're satisfying consumers, they're developing a pool of wealth in their own business. They now have more resources to bid away the workers from other firms. And that's how wages rise, through increased productivity. Now, the important thing to recognize here is that freedom involves not just the enterprise, the free enterprise, not just the free trade, but also what a person does with his own money. That is, he's accumulating wealth. Freedom and the concept of economic liberty entails deciding what to do with it. It may be investing all the money back into the business if the person happens to be the owner of a business. It may be for a worker just putting it away in the bank and letting it earn interest. Or it might be helping out someone in need, or tithing to a church. Or helping somebody with his medical expenses, or helping a parent with old age. But the entire idea of economic liberty revolves around the idea that people themselves make these decisions, that's an essential part of freedom. And as part of that freedom, people might make decisions that everyone else disapproves of. For example, if there's a bunch of people that really desperately need help. They're starving to death, and they come and ask people for donations. Well, some people might donate, and likely would, but others might say, no, I don't want to help you. I want to hoard my wealth. I want to keep it all for myself. And it's an essential aspect of freedom that person be given the right to make that choice. Obviously, if you force him to do what he doesn't want to do with his money, that's an abrogation of freedom. Now, what we're talking about here in an ideal sense then is we take the principles of freedom of religion, where you have a separation of church and state, and we apply this principle to the matter of economic activity, where you have a separation of the economy and the state. So just like we don't have the government regulating and controlling religious activity, or the churches and so forth, the ideal of economic liberty, free enterprise, that is enterprise that is free of government control, or free markets that are free of government regulation, is a separation of economy and the state, where people are free to engage in economic enterprise, enter into trades with others, free trade, and accumulate the fruits of the earnings, and to decide for themselves what to do with it. And there's nothing the government can do about it any more than they can walk into a church whose principles they disapprove of, or they don't like the way it's operating. So you have this principle of separation of church and state. You apply this same principle to the separation of economy and the state. In a related way, we also apply the same principle to the monetary sphere, where a separation of money in the state, which is part of economic activity, where the government has no role in monetary affairs. Whereas what Friedrich Hayek, the Nobel Prize-winning Austrian economist, referred to as the denationalization of money, where money is entirely in the private sector, where the private sector develops the money that's being used, whether it's gold coins or silver coins or bitcoins or some type of money that no one's even thought of before. But there's this separation of economy and the state. Now, of money in the state. Now, if we can also find an area where we integrate the religious liberty concepts with the economic liberty concepts, and where there's an overlap. And that's in the area of where people use their money. That a violation of the principles of liberty would be the government says, well, we love the poor and we think they should be taken care of, so we're going to force you to take some of your money that you're earning and share it with the poor. Well, the concept of economic liberty and religious liberty is no, you need to separate out charity and the state. That charity should be an entirely voluntary thing. That's what freedom's all about, is the right to make these choices. Now, someone might say, well, okay, Jacob, you know, this is all fine and wonderful stuff, but it's sort of pie in the sky. I mean, I get this sometimes. Pie in the sky, idealistic, sounds good, but what's the point? It's not really achievable. It's not really practical. It's utopian. That's often get that term thrown at me. Well, utopian means something that's not achievable. You know, and when they say, well, it's not practical because it's not achievable, that's essentially what they're saying. But there's one problem with their analysis, and that is that at one point in time there were a people who did achieve this. Not perfectly, but pretty close to it. And of course, I'm talking about the 19th century, especially the latter part of the 19th century in the United States. Now, before you throw this question at me, I often get this: Jacob, are you saying that the 19th century was a libertarian paradise? And I said, no, I'm not. I'm not suggesting. We all know it wasn't a libertarian paradise. Well, in the first half of the century, you had slavery, you couldn't find a better violation of the principles of liberty than that. But even in the latter part of the 19th century, you had corporatism, you had government business partnerships, you had some economic regulations at the state and local level, you had the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. So it certainly wasn't a libertarian paradise, and I'm not suggesting that it was. But we have to look at it in a positive sense in terms of what they achieved. And it really is a remarkable thing that our American ancestors in this country achieved that really flies in the face of this practicality objection. Notice what characterized the American system in, let's say, 1890. No income tax. People were free to keep everything they earned and to decide for themselves what to do with it, because there was no welfare state as we know it. There was no Social Security, no Medicare, no Medicaid, no aid to dictatorships, no farm subsidies, no education grants. And in fact, the only federal welfare program that comes to mind is the pensions that were still being paid to the survivors of the Civil War. So you had a society where people really did keep the fruits of their earnings and decide for themselves what to do with it. Enterprise was by and large free of government control. Okay, there were some exceptions, but by and large is what I'm saying. I mean, you're never going to find perfection in any human activity. But here there was no licensing laws. If you wanted to be a lawyer, I mean, you just trained and held out your shingle. And you didn't even have to train. You could just hang out your shingle. You didn't have to get a license from the state. You didn't have to go to a government-approved law school or graduate from a government-approved college. Now, the consumers decided whether you were going to stay in business or not. So if nobody came knocking on your door and willing to pay your fee, you weren't a lawyer for very long because you needed to eat. And the same with physicians. The same with every silversmiths, blacksmiths. I mean, every endeavor was free of government control and regulation. I mean, this is what was meant by the term free enterprise. It was economic enterprise that was free of government control. There was no central bank, no Federal Reserve. You had gold and silver coins as the official money. You know, we often hear that the gold standard was paper money backed by gold. It was nothing of the sort. It was gold and silver coins were the official money. And any notes were circulating were nothing more than promissory notes, promising to pay that official money. Wasn't a perfect system. The government was issuing the coins. There wasn't a free market in money, but it was certainly solid money. It was sound money because Government certainly wasn't debasing the coinage. It wasn't shaving off the edges of the gold coins and melting them down and putting them back into circulation as kings of old had done. It was a very reputable, credible monetary system. You certainly had tariffs, which were a violation of the principles of liberty, but domestically, there was essentially the biggest free trade zone in the world, where people could cross state borders and with their goods and services and not be subject to government controls or regulations. So it really was a remarkable system that we had in terms of the principles of economic liberty. Now, clearly, that's not what we have today. We have a system here in the United States that is highly regulated. You can't be going to many professions without government approval. The law profession is a good example. And it turns out that really the licensure system, they say, well, this is to protect the consumers from unethical or incompetent lawyers. And well, I know from personal experience, having been a lawyer for many years, that it does nothing of the sort. I mean, because you have plenty of unethical, incompetent lawyers out there, and people are lulled into believing that they're all competent and ethical because they got a license from the state. So it actually has this perverse outcome. Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning libertarian economist, he wrote a great essay on occupational licensure in which he took the case of physicians, doctors. He took the toughest case and showed why you shouldn't have licensure of physicians. But it goes all the way down to shoe shine people, hairdressers, taxi drivers. I mean, the list just goes on and on. It's a highly regulated system. Stockbrokers, real estate agents, and it's really, the licensure system really is just a big protection racket that limits the number of people that can be in that particular profession in order to raise their prices for their services in an artificial way. You've got minimum wage laws, price controls, you've got a central bank, and you have presidents that purport to manage the economy. I mean, isn't that one of the major criteria that we apply to presidential candidates? What are you going to do to manage the economy? And then you've got this gigantic welfare state, which takes large portions of people's income and forces them to share with others. I mean, that's what Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, aid to dictators and farm subsidies, the whole welfare state is all about. It's a mandatory confiscation of money from people who have produced it in order to give it to people to whom it really doesn't belong. Now, the irony of all this is that people look at this system, Americans do, as a free enterprise system. Because you see there's elements of markets in it. I mean, you see that people going to work and producing and making money and then writing out their tax returns and rushing to the IRS, to the post office on April 15th to send their return to the IRS. So it has this aura of, oh, America's a free market system. Well, again, when we talk about the concepts of economic liberty, at least the way we libertarians see it, we're talking about enterprise that's free of government control. Not a less regulated society, not a society in which government has a smaller welfare state component than another society. We're talking about a society in where people keep everything they earn. They engage in economic enterprise without licensures, minimum wage laws, price controls, economic regulations, and where people are free to keep everything they earn and decide for themselves what to do with it. Clearly, we don't have that. And you can see that, for example, in the field of education, where you have this massive government involvement, and really it's not the education business, it's the schooling business, where the government, it's really a central planning system where the central board of the school district or the state board of education or the national department of education plan the educational decisions of hundreds or thousands or millions of children. And the government mandates the textbooks, the government hires the employees, the teachers, and everything's government approved. You will never see a course on libertarianism ever being taught in public schools. Why? Because libertarians advocate the dismantling of this really socialist system. Why? Because we believe in free markets. That is, markets that are free of government involvement. So in education, for example, we would say repeal the compulsory attendance laws, repeal the school taxes, get rid of the school buildings, just sell them off or donate them off, and get the state out of the education business the way we've gotten the state out of the religion business. In other words, a free market approach to education, just like we apply to every other peaceful sphere in life. Free market monetary system, where the government has no role in money at all, where the private sector generates the medium of exchange that people are using. Another example of a socialist type system here in American society is the Postal Service. I mean, here you have this government operation that's a monopoly, a genuine monopoly. I mean, the irony of that is that Americans rail against big business, especially Americans on the left, rail against big business and oligopolies and monopolies and mergers, but they always seal their lips when it comes to the Postal Service, which is a genuine monopoly. No one is permitted to compete against the Postal Service in the delivery of first-class mail. And if anybody tries, they'll put him in jail very quickly. Here's your concept of where there is no free market in the delivery of first-class mail, despite the fact that Americans innocently will say, well, yes, we live in a free enterprise country. Retirement, you have a massive government involvement in Social Security, which really involves just taking money from the young and the productive and giving it to the seniors. There is no fund. There never has been a fund. Seniors like to convince themselves, they say, well, I put it in all those years. Well, they didn't put into anything. They just got taxed. Like any other welfare program, they paid income taxes. Whether the tax is called an income tax or a FICA tax or a sales tax, it really doesn't matter. They were taxed and the money was spent. And now what they're effectively saying is we have a right to do this to the younger people, just like that was done to us when we were young. Total violation of the principles of economic liberty. Now, obviously, the people on the left love this thing. I mean, that's how we got where we are today in America. That's why we live in a society now where there is an income tax. There is a IRS, a very terrifying government agency that is ruining the lives of many, many people. You have a DEA that puts people in jail. Imagine, for just ingesting a substance, which really should be nobody's business but the person doing the ingesting. Government intrudes into that life. I mean, you don't find a free market in the possession, distribution, and consumption of drugs. The government has a heavy role in this, putting people into jail for daring to distribute drugs, for daring to possess them, for daring to use them. And so the left brought this kind of system into existence. So that's why we have a Federal Reserve, and we have the whole Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and so forth. Now, what's interesting about conservatives, as compared, of course, to us libertarians, is that they have accepted this. That's the trouble with conservatism, is that conservatives like to conserve. They don't like any major change. And obviously, if we were going to achieve a genuine free enterprise system in America, you're talking about some revolutionary changes here, that scares conservatives. Now, if you have a free society already in existence, conservatives are great, because they want to conserve that free society. And when the welfare state was being proposed and the regulated economy, the managed, centrally planned economy was being proposed by the progressives in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and as the battle was moving up into the 1930s with the Franklin Roosevelt administration and his New Deal, conservatives were standing fast in opposing this. But once the battle was lost, and you ended up with Social Security and then later Medicare and Medicaid under Lyndon Johnson's regime, and the DEA and all the regulatory agencies and all the departments and agencies and these armies of bureaucrats, conservatives threw in the towel. And even worse, they teach their children, and this is why they believe in public schooling so much, they teach their children that this is a free enterprise country. And that's why so many Americans are honestly convinced that they live in a free enterprise system. I mean, that's the value of the public government school system, is the power of indoctrination. I mean, I bet you if you did a survey of just regular Americans and said, what type of economic system do you live in, I'd say 95% of public school graduates, if not more, would say, oh, we live in a free enterprise country. We're not like Cuba. That's a socialist country. We have a free enterprise system. And, of course, Cuba has Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, a central bank, income tax, an IRS, a DEA, immigration controls, trade restrictions, and they just have more of it. Now, there's a choice that libertarians have to make at some point, and that is, are they going to engage in reforming this system, which is really what conservatives do. Conservatives have, people on the left want to expand the system, always. I mean, that's where you have the out-of-control spending and borrowing. It doesn't bother those on the left at all that the United States government, it continues to go into mountains of debt. The national debt continues rising. They raised the debt ceiling just recently to allow more debt to be accumulated, and the left loves it. I mean, as far as they're concerned, there would be no debt limit. They think it's fantastic. They think that government spending and borrowing is the key to prosperity, although they can never explain why it is that countries go bankrupt like Greece and others that have done this. And they just say, print the money and pay it, and they don't worry about inflation. Conservatives, though, say, no, we have a free enterprise system here. Let's just tinker and let's reform it. And that's the choice that faces a lot of libertarians, is should they join the reform crowd and try to tinker and refine the managed economy, the regulated economy, the welfare state, or should they really go for a free society? Now, let me give you an example of this. Educational vouchers. This is a favorite scheme of conservatives, and unfortunately, many libertarians have fallen for it. And they call it choice, you see, or the free market approach to education, where you have school vouchers that are being used to take poor people or middle-class people out of the public school system and put them into private schools. Now, I don't question the objective here. I mean, I think public schooling is very harmful to people. I think it damages children's minds. I think it's a real horror story what goes on in these institutions. They really are institutions of indoctrination, of regimentation, I call it Army light. So yeah, getting a person out of the system and just out of it. I mean, I'm not necessarily suggesting that private schools are significantly better. A lot of the times they're just like mirror images. I mean, they're all government controlled. Here again, we have the licensure system, where the private schools have to be licensed by the state. So again, a genuine free market educational system is one where the government has no role, no licenses. People choose the best educational vehicle for each of their children. They treat their children in a unique, independent way, because each child really is unique. He's different from everyone else. But conservatives say, well, no, Jacob, we got to have vouchers here. This is choice. That's an interesting term they use, choice, because what they mean by this is they're giving the recipient of the voucher choices on which private schools to use their voucher. But you see, the problem with that is that a thief has choices. You know, if a thief goes and breaks into a house and steals, let's say, $10,000 in jewels, he's not got choice. You know, anybody that's got additional money in his hands has choice. And so the choice is really not the objective here. We're talking about freedom and moral principles that are the objective. So the thief taking the money and, let's say, giving it to a person whose children need an education, yeah, the person that gets the money, he has choice now as to how to educate his children. But is that really moral? And notice that what the voucher proponents do is they end up engaging in activity that really should be condemned. I mean, part of the socialist system in education is the idea of taking money from people to whom it belongs and funding this huge system to subsidize the schooling of people who have children. And we libertarians argue that's morally wrong. Again, why? Because remember the principles of economic liberty. The fundamental God-given right that pre-exists government to keep everything you earn and you decide what to do with it. So by advocating vouchers, they're really abandoning, the conservatives and those libertarians that endorse vouchers are abandoning the very principle, the moral principle that is so highly objectionable in any socialist system, the forcible taking of money from people and giving it to others. And then, of course, you've got the deep entrenchment. In the early days, even Friedman, who was the prime proponent of vouchers, they were arguing that vouchers will lead to freedom, to educational liberty. Well, we often argued as libertarians in the early days that was never going to happen, because the schools become dependent on the vouchers. The ones that are receiving this, they expand their buildings and their staff, and they're going to be the last ones that say, hey, okay, ready to dismantle the voucher system in the public school system. And so it actually makes the situation worse. It puts more and more schools on the dole, the government dole. It entrenches this violation of moral principles of liberty. It's really an anti-freedom measure that is being adopted here. And the same thing, like I say, with Social Security. I mean, there is this, we all know that Social Security is a socialist system. It was originally thought of by German socialists. It was adopted by Bismarck of Germany. It was imported into the United States. Roosevelt adopted it and revolutionized America's society with it. It's a socialistic system because it takes money from some people and gives to another. Well, then you've got the conservatives, and unfortunately many libertarians that say, oh, well, let's reform this system. We'll have the free market approach to Social Security. That's what they call it. And so their system is, we're going to let everybody keep what they earn, but we're going to mandate that they have to invest a certain portion of it in a savings account that's going to be managed by some government-approved stock companies or banking companies. Well, and they call this choice, again, and they call it the free market approach. It's really an abuse of the English language. It's abuse of the language of liberty. That it's not free market at all. It's really just, well, to put it bluntly, it's economic fascism. Now, what is economic fascism? Well, it's an economic philosophy where the government says, we're not going to take your money from you and give it to others. We're going to let you keep it like a privilege, but we're going to force you to do what we want with your money. We're going to control your property. So property remains in private hands, so you have private ownership, but the government controls the use of the resources. So you have the spectacle of libertarians supporting really what is a fascistic device, and then the big debate starts: which is better, the voucher system, for Social Security, or the socialist system? Well, it's really a debate between fascism and socialism. Which system's better? And there's arguments on both sides, but who cares? It's not freedom. It's not economic liberty. It's not free markets. It's fascism versus socialism. So I would say that really what we libertarians should be all about is not what conservatives are all about. That we should be about liberty. That if we had a government system of government-run or government-regulated churches, and somebody said, hey, what should we do about this mess, constant crises in the churches and the corruption and all that comes with it, there would be certainly those that say, well, let's have a voucher system for the churches, and let's have better people in public office to manage the churches. And well, we libertarians would say, forget all that. Just separate the church and state. Get the government out of the religion business. And that's what we should be saying about the economy. Get the government out of the business of managing the economy. The president can go watch television. He doesn't need to manage the economy. Leave people free to manage their own economic activities. This is what Smith was arguing for in The Wealth of Nations. This is what Jefferson was talking about in the Declaration of Independence, that these are fundamental rights with which no government can legitimately interfere. And when they do interfere with it, you end up with ongoing crises, chaos, monetary debauchery, privation, and ultimately a society in which people are really starving to death. I mean, that's the ultimate outcome of the concept of socialism and fascism. It's not just the constant conflicts and chaos and fighting that goes on whenever government's involved in a peaceful activity. It's also the economic consequences, which means impoverishment for the citizenry. On that note, why don't we wrap up now and open it up for some questions from the audience.
Well, thank you very much, Bumper. That was that was quite something. I'm familiar with the economy and state separation just for the same reasons and same logic as church and state, but to hear it enunciated not just so clearly but so passionately was it was pretty awesome. I mean, that's very hardcore to come down on libertarians who like school vouchers. I mean, Milton and Rose Friedman were in favor of that. How can you argue with Milton and Rose Friedman?
Well, an interesting side story to that is that I wrote a piece in the very first year of the Future of Freedom Foundation in 1990. I wrote in our monthly journal, Future of Freedom, an essay in which I criticized the voucher proponents, saying that this is just a way to try to make socialism work. And lo and behold, Milton Friedman gives a speech a couple of months later, a public speech where he mentions the Future of Freedom Foundation. He says we're doing great work, and he mentions my article where he takes me to task and criticizes me for being uncompromising and dogmatic, and he actually argued that he says, yeah, sure, Hornberger's right, economic liberty is the goal, but how do you get there? And, well, I would argue you get there by simply repealing compulsory attendance laws, getting rid of the state. Friedman argued, and that speech was later reduced to writing, to an article in Liberty, it's online. Friedman argued, well, no, you get there through vouchers. So his argument was this is just a transition device. Well, today the voucher proponents don't even make that argument. They make the argument this will improve public schooling because I think they figured out that it was never gonna result in the eradication of public schooling, and it was hurting their cause because people were saying, well, I don't think I want to support vouchers if it means the end of public schooling. So you end up totally with an abandonment of your principles by advocating compromising.
That's pretty funny. We have some questions here from the audience, but I can't resist mentioning that. It reminds me very much of Karl Marx, roughly 100 years before, saying, well, we need the strong state just until the apparatus of capitalism withers away, and then it'll be an anarchist utopia where we won't have to have the state. It's just a transition phase. Anyway, okay, so we have several questions here. The first one is, and everybody's familiar with the Heritage Foundation rankings and other sources, but according to you, what's your take? Where is the freest enterprise jurisdiction in the world today?
So that's a tough question. I know that the U.S. has now dropped to, I think, third or fourth or fifth or something like that. I really don't know because I really can't point to any models. In every nation on earth, the government takes the position that it has the legitimate authority to regulate, manage economic activity. No one questions the notion of licensure laws or minimum wage laws or price controls or central banks. So I'm really reluctant to say, hey, there's one to point to, because really what it is the country you're going to be pointing to is one that has less of the controls and management. But that's not freedom, and that's the point I'm trying to make here, is that my model, as imperfect as it is, let's say 1890 America, where you have no income tax, no IRS, no central bank, no Federal Reserve. You had tariffs, I would argue, for total free trade, no immigration controls, no public schooling systems, and then we build on that. Again, I'm not saying it was a libertarian paradise. You had the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, you had corporatism, but you build on that. What I was trying to say is you can achieve that because they showed that you could achieve that, and then let's build on it. Let's abolish all the tariffs and trade restrictions, have total free trade unilaterally, no negotiating with anybody, and build on that.
Well, we have a similar question, and not to try to put you in a box here, but is there a country that comes closest in your mind, perhaps, to 19th century America anywhere in the world?
Not in terms of principle. No, because every one of them, there may be less.
A related question, Evaldos asked, is there any that don't have an income tax today?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't know. There might
used
well
to be Uruguay and Paraguay. Uruguay went ahead and bit the bullet and succumbed to the pressure, international pressure, and instituted an income tax. And last I heard, Paraguay had passed legislation but never implemented it. So it might still be the case in Paraguay. We have friends there we can ask.
We don't often think of Uruguay and Paraguay as bastions of free societies. In fact, Paraguay, I think, had a dictator for a few decades or so.
Yeah, they did. His name was Stroessner. That was a while ago. Actually, this is neither here nor there, but when I was there recently, I was arguing with several senators that I met with and people like that they ought to become the new Switzerland, because Switzerland is no longer Switzerland in terms of international finance anymore. Okay, we have another question, and that is, what about the poor, the homeless, the single mothers? You know, how were they taken care of in 1890s United States? Were they just left on the streets to starve, like in a Charles Dickens novel, or what happened?
Well, that's what we're taught to believe, that the Industrial Revolution was a horrific period where, I mean, the implication is that fathers hated their children and hated their wives. Otherwise, they would never have forced them in the factories to work those long working hours and unsafe working conditions. Actually, it's the exact opposite. You see, as Hayek pointed out, the right comparison is not by comparing what was going on then with now. It's what was going on then with before then. The reason that people were sending their wives and children into the factories was this is the only way to survive. The level of prosperity was so small, so low, that people needed to do anything to survive. Then as capital starts getting developed and people start accumulating wealth, that's what enabled women now to stay at home and children to stay at home and have a real childhood. But all charity was voluntary. And people say, oh, well, you know, no, the left is really good at this. They say, I would take care of the poor, I would donate, but no one else would. Well, if you just count up those number of people, you'd have a few million. But this is how the opera houses got built, the churches got built, the soup kitchens got going, the museums, the libraries. When people were free to accumulate wealth, it was the greatest outburst, not just of economic prosperity, it was also the greatest outburst of charitable activity that mankind had ever seen. I mean, think about it. The more wealth that's being produced in a society, the greater can be the level of charitable activity, and this is exactly what was happening. And then there's a spillover effect here, Louis, that if you take like a nun here in the United States who takes a vow of poverty, a Catholic nun, she will live in a very much better way of life, a much better way of life, economically speaking, than her counterpart in, say, Guatemala. She will drive a nicer car. She will have better living conditions, dormitory type thing, libraries, access to good food, simply because there is this spillover effect that comes from a more prosperous society as compared to a more impoverished society.
I have another question shaping up here, but it's not clear to me. I'm asking the audience to, or the fellow in the audience to redefine. But that's an interesting point about context. You know, even stepping aside from history for a moment, you look at today's world and people like to lambast the owners and operators of these horrible sweatshops in poor countries and talk about how horrible it is that children or single mothers will work all these long hours in these factories. And I'm not saying that it's paradise or that I'd want to do that. But the alternative for some of these children working in these factories is child prostitution or just simply death. And if they make that choice as an improvement in their lot, you know, how is anybody, any do-gooder on the other side of the world, helping them to say, no, they can't have that choice?
Yeah, they're not helping them all. They're condemning them to die with child labor laws. I mean, if you had children and the only way you could enable them to survive from starvation is by putting them into a factory where they're working long working hours in very unsafe conditions, I don't think any parent in the world would hesitate to take the option of life, as miserable as it is, to the certainty of death. And that's what people were faced with during the Industrial Revolution. In Hobbes's words, prior to the Industrial Revolution, life was nasty, brutish, and short. I mean, people would live to maybe 20 years old maximum. And so all of a sudden, this gave them a chance to survive. There was no more famines. I mean, notice there's never been a famine in the United States, as there were in, like in Ireland, the potato famine and stuff. So here, people, the poor, finally had a chance to survive and prosper. I mean, no immigration controls. And all these poor people from other countries were flooding into America, knowing that the government wasn't going to take care of them, knowing that there was no guarantees. but they had a chance to not only survive, they had a chance to prosper. And for those that really needed the help, the destitute, people who had cancer or whatever, that's where voluntary charity came in. So in the response to that earlier question, yeah, you rely on doctors. You don't need Medicare. You don't need Medicaid. You rely on doctors to provide assistance to the poor just as part of the profession, as part of all the money they're making from those who are able to pay.
It seems like a good moment to mention Alexis de Tocqueville and Democracy in America. It's a book that really addresses a lot of these questions and what he saw during this time period.
That's a fantastic point. I mean, that's what he came over here, he was marveling. Here's this French guy that coming over and says, I want to discover what's going on in this country. Why the reasons for greatness? Why is there more prosperity here? Because, you know, people say, what's the reason why a country is wealthy? Well, it has natural resources. Well, really? Well, then why is Mexico and Venezuela broke when they have all that oil? But what de Tocqueville realized is that it was this system of free enterprise where government wasn't playing hardly any role, that was causing people to have this enormous amount of prosperity. And he noticed something else. He said there's all these voluntary organizations. There's the association for this and the association for that, and everybody voluntarily getting together to try to eradicate the bad, evil things in society, like drinking or whatever, you know, the anti-prohibition league or the prohibition league or something. But it was all voluntary. And this is what a free society produces. It produces wealth, it produces higher standards of living, and it produces exercises of conscience where people are engaged in this voluntary charitable activity.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I have asked for any last questions, and somebody is typing in the chat window. We'll see if we get one, but I want to go ahead and, okay. Question about minorities. Jacob is expecting charities to grow much more and function more effectively if the society could accumulate more wealth, and the government is disallowed to support minorities, disabled, blah, 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 without a tax system. Is that correct?
Yeah, that it's all voluntary, that people that need assistance, I mean, the thing about a free enterprise system, a genuine free enterprise system, is that there's employment opportunities for everybody who wants them. So you have no minimum wage law that's locking people out of the labor market anymore. You don't have licensure laws where people have to go through these expensive courses or college or law schools or professional schools, that everything's voluntary. So there is no institutional unemployment as there is today, for example, among black teenagers. There's like a chronic 60% unemployment rate or 50% unemployment rate. So the poor have opportunities to work. That's the best way you help people, by enabling them to giving them an institutional structure where they help themselves. But for those that are truly needy, and there's no question that there's people that are truly needy. I mean, you can go in the cancer wards of hospitals. There's people that are dying. Yeah, you rely on voluntary charity, and this is how hospitals get built. You can go to hospitals right now and see this wing was built by such and such a person, some multimillionaire. And this is what we have to restore in America, this belief that you can believe in people, that you don't have to have the government forcing them, because mandatory charity is really not charity at all. So we have to believe in ourselves, and we have to believe in others, and we have to believe in free markets. We have to believe in economic liberty.
Excellent points. We actually have a couple questions here that are related to funding for school systems, but you addressed that earlier, and I think the main point, that, not to put words in your mouth though, is whether we use land sections like in Louisiana Purchase that funded schools, or private donations to fund schools and so on. You still have the licensing system and the government control of the education system that imposes a uniformly dreary product regardless of the funding. Would that be your view?
Yeah, get rid of the licensing. Get rid of all government involvement in education. Think of churches. Okay, we don't have government licensing ministers or churches or whatever. Just get rid of all state involvement in education. So there's no licensures, there's no taxation. It's all private. We automatically come to the assumption that schooling is necessary for education. I question that. There's a lot of people that are homeschooling. I mean, we know that for a fact. But there may be educational vehicles that no one's ever thought of before. This is another virtue of the free market I didn't mention, is that it brings into existence things that bring utter surprise, where it's like, wow, I never thought of that before. that's one of the virtues of the market. And I think the same thing applies in education, is that maybe some people are better suited to learn in different ways than just sitting in a classroom listening to a lecture. And
very good.
that's
Okay,
what freedom is.
This has been a terrific, energetic conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today. We will continue the conversation, our discussion forums later, but I need to go ahead and wrap this up so we can get ready for our next speaker, Doug Casey. I want to remind everybody that you need to click on the separate links for each talk to see each person and be able to chat with us online and share questions. Once again, Jacob Hornberger, Future Freedom Foundation, Hardcore Freedom Philosophy, thank you so much for sharing.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it. And thank the audience.